Today's video is sponsored by Readly. While I was filming my video on Kentish Town, I popped into a charity shop. While I was there, I found this book, or magazine, I guess it's one of those bookazines, on the future of railways. I couldn't find a publication date for this, but it alludes to a timetable change happening in autumn 1961, so I think it's reasonable to assume that that's the year it came out. Now, I love old predictions of the future, you know, those wacky ones where they reckon we'll all be zipping around on high-speed monorails or personal helicopters in the year 1970 or something. I don't know, blame Jerry Anderson. This isn't quite like that. It's more of a look at what was the cutting edge of rail technology in Britain at the start of the 60s. This was kind of a weird time for the railways. The last mainline steam engines on British railways would go out of service in 1968. In fact, the last steam locomotive built by British Railways, Evening Star, came out of the workshop in 1960. The modernisation plan was being implemented, which hoped to drag the railways of Britain into the modern era by, apparently, getting rid of most of them. The modernisation plan was both complicated and controversial, too complicated and too controversial to fully cover in this silly little video. But one of the key aspects was that it was to get rid of steam, electrify lines where possible, and bring in diesels where it wasn't possible. However, with hindsight, perhaps the biggest issue was that they wanted to implement this too quickly. What this meant was that companies with little experience of building diesel locomotives were given orders for locomotives that they didn't have time to properly develop. There were companies with that experience, but either they weren't British or they didn't have the capacity for this size of order, and the government insisted that British Railways should buy British. The result was a wide variety of non-standardised locomotives, many of which didn't work very well. To give an extreme example, the North British Type 1s, later known as the Class 16s, were so unreliable that they were allocated to East London so that they would never be far from the works at Stratford if and when they broke down. To cap it off, many of the duties that these engines were built for would disappear over the coming years, rendering even the good ones redundant. This book, however, is not interested in doom and gloom. Many of the problems I mentioned were not yet evident. It opens with a confident extolling of the virtues of the new Deltics. Now, the Deltics actually were a good locomotive. Express engines designed for the East Coast Main Line. When this was published, the only Deltic was the striking prototype, which is now preserved as part of the National Collection. But the production engines would be one of the modernisation plan's great successes, and they have a cult following to this day. On the subject of modernisation, one thing no one predicted was the convenience of this video's sponsor, Readly. Readly is the perfect app if you're riding on a British train and you have a lot of time to kill because it turned out the modernisation plan didn't go so well and you're stuck for an hour outside Doncaster. What it is an app for reading magazines. With a single, very decently priced monthly subscription, you can get access to literally thousands of magazines on all sorts of subjects on your phone, tablet, laptop, desktop. I don't think it works for pocket calculators yet. You don't have to be that one guy taking up space in the newsagents, browsing magazines for ages, getting in everyone's way while you try to decide which of these will keep you occupied for the next 7 hours. For me, I find it mightily handy for research, because for a fraction of the price of paper magazines I can read several different takes on a story or even look through back issues to see how it developed. And if you want to make friends on your train journey, each account can be shared with up to 6 people. If this sounds good to you, then follow the link in the description below and you can get 2 months free, which you can cancel at any time. So, that's the situation in 2023. Let's go back to 1960. Did they even have mobile phones back then? Next, the book talks about multiple units. Once again, they're on the money. Multiple units are the backbone of passenger trains even today. Sets of carriages with motors built in. They make much of the comfort of the ride. Well, I don't know what they were like back then, but having ridden on some of these first-generation units myself, they tend to be awful bumpy. I love the bit about how you can see Britain from a diesel multiple unit. If you find yourself on a heritage railway on one of these things, one of the best things about them is that you can see out of the front, which is great if the line is pleasantly scenic. It's a real shame modern trains don't have that feature, in my opinion. Next, we get a brief rundown of the different types of transmission in diesel locomotives. Again, this is all a little technical for me to go into here, but maybe a future video. What it does highlight is, again, the fact that things were so non-standard. Most regions of British Railways had figured that electric transmission was the way to go, but the Western region preferred hydraulic. There's a good shot of these locomotives, which anyone who grew up with Thomas the Tank Engine will recognise as Metropolitan Vickers diesel-electric Type 2s. We get a discussion of the progress of dieselisation. Interestingly, they do highlight the lack of standardisation and the fact that the whole thing was rushed, but they treat it as a process of evolution. Well, I mean it was, but it was also quite a lot of money thrown away that might have been saved by a longer lead time. There's a brief photo item on the Midland Pullman, better known to rail fans as the Blue Pullmans. This was a luxurious diesel train that ran between London and Manchester. There was also one on the Western region. In the long run it was economically unviable, and there was that old problem of ride quality. Not something you want when you're serving soup. The service ended in 1973 and all the units were scrapped, much to the dismay of enthusiasts. These trains are well remembered, and even now there are trains running in a livery deliberately intended to evoke this brief era of high-end travel. The modern trains are intercity 125s, which in some ways are a descendant of the Blue Pullmans. Thereafter we zip on to electrification. The idea was, in the long run, full electrification of all railways. And we're talking the very long run, because even now, not all lines in Britain are electrified. We also have the problem that there's more than one form of electrification. Different companies use different methods of powering their electric trains, and by the time the modernisation plan came out, there was too much already electrified track to make standardisation economically viable. These days we have dual voltage trains that can pick up power from overhead wires or third rails. I guess what I like about this book is the sense of optimism I get from it. It represents a spirit of progress that you just don't get on modern railways. Whenever a new project comes about in Britain, you get a chorus of people desperate to find whatever fault they can. Now, I don't doubt that such people existed back then. I'm sure the modernisation plan had as many critics as it does now. But nevertheless, this feels like a glimpse of a brighter, parallel universe. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do click the like button and consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the hydraulic transmission to my Western Region diesel locomotive. Thanks also to Readly for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.